In 2014, Coffee Lamb was secretly recorded inside a public restroom. The audio was leaked and immediately broadcast to the entire city. In one night, she lost her TVB contract, her reputation, and eventually her health. This is the story of a 30-minute recording that crossed the line from journalism to abuse. The velocity of this destruction was rooted in the ruthless machinery that built Coffee Lamb, or Lam Tin Yu, in the first place. By 2014, the Hong Kong entertainment industry, specifically the television monopoly held by Television Broadcast Limited, operated less like a creative sanctuary and more like a high-pressure industrial complex. Located in the remote, smog-choked industrial estate of Cheung, TVB City, was a fortress of content production where dreams were manufactured on a rigid, unforgiving assembly line. For a young actress like Lam, born in 1989 and entering this system with hopes of artistic validation, the reality was a brutal education in commodification. Rather than a screen queen, she was a contract worker in a glamorous sweatshop, trading long hours, sleep deprivation, and total obedience for a sliver of public recognition. The desperation had a metric. The standard operating procedure at TVB during this era was known internally as the 06-28 schedule. Filming began at 6 a.m. and often continued until 4 a.m. the next day. Actresses slept in makeup chairs or on the floor of the dressing rooms, grabbing 20 minutes of rest between takes. There was no overtime pay. There were no unions. For a monthly salary of roughly $2,000 in one of the most expensive cities on earth, Lam maintained a wardrobe of designer gowns and the complexion of a supermodel while running on a caloric deficit and zero sleep. In this ecosystem, Lam had carved out a specific, albeit dangerous, niche. She was 24 years old, possessed of a physicality that the camera loved, and the network executives knew exactly how to exploit it. In the rigid caste system of Hong Kong television, actresses were often categorized into binary archetypes. While the station's protected fadans played the virtuous heroines, rising stars with less political cover were assigned the role of the sensual disruptor. Coffee Lamb was cast firmly in the latter category, a position designed specifically to command the male gaze rather than garner sympathy. Her breakout role in the massive hit series Triumph in the Skies 2 had already cemented her public image in a way that would prove prophetic. In the series, she played a minor but memorable role that required her to wear a bikini, her character's chest pressed against a male lead to shield him from cold water. The scene went viral, racking up millions of views online and defining her career by a few seconds of titillation. The industry had explicitly marketed her sexuality, turning her body into a public asset, creating a dangerous paradox. The network profited from her allure, using her to spike ratings among male demographics, yet it simultaneously demanded she adhere to a puritanical code of conduct off-screen. This was the hypocritical tightrope she walked daily: be desirable enough to generate revenue, but chaste enough to satisfy the conservative moral guardians of the station's management, led by the formidable Virginia Locke. The message was clear but unspoken. Sell the fantasy of availability, but never, ever act on it. This precarious balance extended to her finances. To the outside world, she was a celebrity, a face recognized on billboards, magazine covers, and bus advertisements. But the financial reality of a mid-tier TVB artist in 2014 was often starkly different from the perceived glamour. The base salaries for artists at her level were notoriously low, often comparable to that of a fresh office graduate. forcing artists to rely heavily on show fees, money earned from external appearances. These included cutting ribbons at mall openings, attending promotional galas, endorsing beauty products, and maintaining a high profile in the city's nightlife. Being seen was not just a vanity project for Coffee Lamb, it was a survival strategy. In the hyper-capitalist environment of Hong Kong, visibility was currency. If an artist vanished from the gossip columns for a month, their booking fees dropped. This necessity to socialize, to be present in the VIP rooms and the champagne mixers of Central, placed young women like Lamb in a perpetual state of vulnerability. They were required to navigate spaces dominated by wealthy patrons, investors, and aggressive media, blurring the lines between professional networking and personal risk. The dinner culture of the entertainment industry meant that young actresses were often expected to provide atmosphere at gatherings of the elite, smiling and drinking to maintain the connections that kept their careers afloat. June 2014 found Lamb in a particularly fragile state of mind, a psychological detail often buried under the sensationalism of the scandal. The polished veneer of the television star hid a young woman navigating the messy, unscripted chaos of her 20s. She had recently exited a stable relationship, leaving her with the raw, exposed nerves of a fresh heartbreak. Those who knew her at the time described a person who was seeking release, a break from the suffocating discipline of the TVB filming schedule and the emotional void of her personal life. It is a psychological state familiar to many, yet for a public figure, this ordinary human desire for distraction carries a catastrophic potential. The evening began with the standard rituals of Hong Kong's social elite: dinner, drinks, and the heavy, humid air of a city that never really sleeps. Alcohol played a significant, undeniable role in the events that followed. In later interviews, including a candid confession to the South China Morning Post, Lamb would admit to being intoxicated, a detail that is crucial not to excuse the events, but to contextualize the collapse of her judgment. Alcohol acts as a solvent for caution. For a woman who spent every waking hour guarding her reputation, constantly monitoring her posture, her words, and her angles for the cameras, the liquor offered a momentary suspension of the rules. It lowered the deflector shields that normally protected her from the predatory nature of the city. It was in this haze of wine and loud music that her path intersected with Will Lamb. Contrary to the later tabloid frenzy that tried to paint him as a billionaire scion to spice up the narrative, Will was a 31-year-old company director. He was successful, but a civilian in the war of celebrity culture. There was no sordid transaction, merely two people fueled by drink and chemistry finding a connection. As the night deepened and the venue became stifling, the decision was made to move. They left the initial party seeking a change of atmosphere, perhaps seeking quiet, or perhaps simply following the drift of the night. They gravitated towards the IFC Mall in Central. At night, the International Finance Center is a strange, paradoxical space. By day, it is the beating heart of Asian finance, a cathedral of glass and steel teeming with bankers, luxury shoppers, and tourists. It is a monument to consumerism, sanitized and bright. But by late evening, after the boutiques have shuttered and the shoppers have retreated to the mid-levels, it transforms into a ghost town of marble corridors and silent storefronts. It echoes. It offers an illusion of privacy, a false sense that one is alone in the middle of the metropolis. They wandered through the deserted concourses of the mall. The alcohol in Lamb's system was now dictating the tempo of the interaction. The rational fear of the paparazzi, the instinct that usually made her scan every corner for a lens, the internal radar that every Hong Kong celebrity develops, had been dulled. She was not thinking about her contract with TVB, which contained strict morality clauses. She was not thinking about the conservative viewership that sustained her salary. She was arguably not thinking at all, existing purely in the sensory confusion of the moment, guided by impulse and the false security of the empty hallway. They stopped near a public restroom. It was a mundane facility tucked away in the labyrinth of the luxury mall, designed for utility, not romance. The choice they made next was impulsive, fatal, and heavily scrutinized in the years to come. Instead of separate facilities or simply leaving the area to find a taxi, they moved towards the toilet designated for people with disabilities. It was a single spacious room with a locking door, offering a sanctuary that felt absolute. To their intoxicated minds, that heavy door represented a barrier against the world. They believed that once the latch clicked shut, they had successfully exited the public stage. They believed they were invisible. However, the silence of the mall was a trap. The Hong Kong paparazzi ecosystem of 2014 was a tactical machine. Major tabloids operated spotter networks, effectively deputizing the service industry. Valets and taxi drivers served as paid informants, and a tip regarding Coffee Lamb had likely triggered the chase teams before she even arrived at the mall. These photographers hunted in wolf packs, predicting trajectories and moving parallel to their targets. Locally, these units are known as Gaozai Dui, or the puppy squads, a term that sounds cute but describes a relentless tracking capability. They operated on a bounty system. A waiter tipping off a magazine about a celebrity's location could earn half a month's salary in a single phone call. This created a citywide surveillance grid where every citizen became a potential spy. Upon entering the IFC, Lam stepped directly into a finely tuned commercial dragnet designed to monetize her privacy. When Lam and Will entered the disabled restroom, seeking a sanctuary behind a locked door, they believed they had exited the public stage. They were unaware that the privacy of the facility was compromised by ventilation slats near the floor. Outside, the hunters arrived. These were tactical surveillance units. They physically crouched on the mall tiles, pressing high-sensitivity microphones and video lenses against the bottom gap of the door. They adjusted audio levels to isolate human speech from the ambient hum of air conditioning, stealing sound from the air. For 30 minutes they waited, recording every whisper and rustle, turning a private moment into a digital weapon. The psychological state of the hunters is as important as that of the prey. To work as a paparazzi in Hong Kong during the golden era of tabloid journalism was to suspend standard human empathy in favor of the kill. These reporters were under immense pressure from editors to deliver content that would shock. A photo of Coffee Lamb holding hands would be worth a standard fee. A photo of her kissing would be double. But a scandal involving a public restroom? That was a career-making event. It promised the cover of the Sunday edition. When the couple entered the restroom, the paparazzi faced a choice that defines the ethical abyss of this entire saga. A respectful journalist, or even a human being with a basic moral compass, might have taken a photo of them entering and left it at that, the implication being clear enough. But the team outside that door decided that implication was insufficient. They wanted confirmation. They wanted the raw data of the act itself. This is where the transition from journalism to surveillance occurred. They approached the door not as reporters, but as spies. The layout of the disabled toilet became their weapon. These doors often have ventilation slats near the bottom to allow airflow. They are not soundproofed for interrogation. They are built for privacy, not secrecy. The reporters physically got down on their hands and knees on the dirty floor of the public corridor. This image is crucial. Grown men, professionals representing major media corporations, crouching on mall tiles, pressing their ears and their equipment against the bottom of a toilet door. They deployed digital voice recorders and the video mode of their DSLR cameras, positioning the microphones as close to the gaps in the door frame as physically possible. They checked their audio levels, ensuring the gain was cranked up to capture the faintest whisper. This was a technical operation. They were adjusting for the ambient hum of the air conditioning, isolating the frequencies of human speech. They were stealing the sound from the air. For 30 minutes they waited. This duration is significant. It was not a fleeting moment of eavesdropping. It was a prolonged siege. During this half hour they had ample time to reconsider the morality of their actions. They had time to think, is this too far? Yet the recording light kept blinking red. They listened to the intimacy, the confused conversation, the sounds of two people in a vulnerable, compromised state. They did not turn away. In fact, as the minutes ticked by, their excitement likely grew. They knew they weren't just capturing a story, they were capturing a weapon. The hunters also prepared the visual ambush. Knowing the door would eventually open, they positioned themselves in a semicircle, creating a kill box at the exit with flash settings adjusted to maximum brightness. They aimed to capture the shock and terror in high definition. Rather than documenting reality, they were staging a public execution, waiting for the condemned to walk out onto the scaffold. Inside the room, Coffee and Will were oblivious. They believed the lock on the door was a guarantee of safety. They did not know that the privacy they thought they had secured was an illusion. The silence outside was not empty. It was the held breath of a predator about to spring. The hunters had their fingers on the shutter buttons, their recording devices full of incriminating audio, and their consciences fully suppressed. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and all that was left was the final blinding reveal. The door handle turned. The click of the unlocking mechanism was the loudest sound in the world, and the hunters smiled. The moment the lock clicked and the door swung open, the physical ambush began. But the true violence of that night had already occurred, captured silently on magnetic tape and digital memory cards. While the blinding flashes of the cameras would provide the visual iconography of the scandal. Coffee Lamb shielding her face, Will Lamb looking stunned and cornered. The real weapon that would dissect Coffee Lamb's soul was not the photograph. It was the audio. The recording was devastating because of the unique psychological power of sound. Unlike visual media, which shows exactly what is happening, audio demands participation. When a listener hears a recording of a private moment, disjointed whispers, the rustle of fabric, sharp intakes of breath, the confused, intoxicated dialogue of two people in the dark, the brain is forced to fill in the blanks. The listener becomes a co-creator of the scene. The imagination, fueled by voyeuristic curiosity, constructs a visual narrative far more graphic and sordid than anything a camera could capture. By releasing the audio, the media did not just report on an event. They built a theater in the mind of every citizen in Hong Kong and invited them to direct the play. The existence of this recording transformed the scandal from a sighting into a panopticon. In the philosopher Michel Foucault's concept of the panopticon, the prisoner is constantly visible to the guard, but the guard is unseen. In the case of Coffee Lamb, technology inverted this. She was trapped in a digital cell where millions of invisible guards, the public, could hear her, judge her, and mock her, while she could see none of them. The privacy of the toilet stall, the most sacredly private space in modern society, was turned inside out. The walls became transparent. The technical nature of the recording reveals the profound intrusion. This was not overheard conversation in a restaurant. This was captured sound. The reporters had pressed high-sensitivity microphones against the ventilation slats, the literal cracks in the armor of privacy. They captured the wet sounds of the environment, the echo of the tiles, the harsh acoustics of the small room. These sonic details gave the recording a visceral, "you are there" quality. When the files were later uploaded to news portals like Apple Daily's website and YouTube channels, they were often accompanied by subtitles. This was a crucial editorial decision. The audio was murky, muffled by the door, and the ambient noise of the mall's HVAC system. By adding subtitles, the media editors imposed their own narrative on the sounds. A vague noise became a gasp, and an indistinct word became a sexual command. They guided the audience's interpretation, ensuring that even the most ambiguous sound was read in the most incriminating light possible, effectively translating the raw audio into the language of scandal. The content of the 30-minute tape, disjointed as it was, became the scripture of her condemnation. It captured the intimacy of the act, yes, but more damagingly, it captured the vulnerability. It recorded the confusion of intoxication. It recorded the unguarded, messy reality of human desire that is never meant to be audited. There were moments of dialogue that, when stripped of context and plastered on the front page, made Coffee Lamb sound not like a woman in love or lust, but like a caricature of promiscuity. The recording stripped her of her dignity, her poise, and her defense. A photo shows a moment. A 30-minute audio tape steals a slice of time and plays it on an infinite loop. Then came the visual assault. The smoking gun of the audio was compounded by the execution at the door. When the couple finally exited the restroom, the paparazzi did not merely take photos, they engaged in visual warfare. The corridor, previously dim and quiet, was instantly flooded with strobe light intensity. The flashes were blinding, disorienting, designed to induce panic. The images that emerged from that ambush are studies in cruelty. They captured Coffee Lamb in the classic walk of shame posture, head bowed low, hair disheveled, hands covering her face, body shrinking inward as if trying to disappear into itself. It is the universal body language of the hunted. In contrast, Will Lamb was captured looking bewildered, his face exposed, his expression one of shock rather than shame. The visual framing was immediate and gendered. She was the fallen woman hiding her sin. He was the caught man facing the music. The reporters physically blocked their path, shouting questions that were less about journalism and more about provocation. What were you doing in there? Why the disabled toilet? Do you know who he is? They shoved microphones into her face, invading her personal space, forcing her to physically recoil. The camera lenses were inches from her skin, capturing every pore, every smear of makeup, every tear. They were harvesting her humiliation in 4K resolution. This combination of the audio panopticon and the visual ambush created a total sensory encirclement. There was nowhere to hide. If you closed your eyes, you heard the tape. If you covered your ears, you saw the photos. The media had created a 360-degree nightmare. The file-sharing sites and forums of Hong Kong, HK Golden discussed .com, starlet.hk lit up with traffic. The audio file was downloaded, remixed, analyzed, and mocked. It became a ringtone. It became a meme. The toilet gathering became the water cooler conversation of the entire city. But the most chilling aspect of this phase was the silence of the law. In 2014, what the reporters did was technically legal. There was no specific criminal statute in Hong Kong forbidding the recording of audio in a public corridor, even if the microphone was pointed at a private space. The personal data ordinance existed, but it was a toothless tiger against the press, lacking criminal sanctions for this specific type of intrusion. The paparazzi knew this. They operated in the gray zone, exploiting the lag between technology and legislation. They knew they could steal her voice and sell it, and the police could do nothing but watch. Coffee Lamb was not just a victim of a few rogue photographers. She was a victim of a legal system that had not yet decided that a woman's privacy in a restroom was a right worth protecting with handcuffs. The tape was out. The verdict was already being written in the court of public opinion, and the defendant had not even been allowed to speak. The physical ambush at the IFC mall was brutal, but it was finite. It ended when Coffee Lamb managed to escape into a taxi. The psychological ambush that followed, however, was infinite. It began the moment the printing presses of Apple Daily, Ming Pao, and Oriental Daily began to roll, and it exploded exponentially when the servers of Hong Kong's digital forums ignited. This was the trial by media, a judicial process with no judge, no jury, no defense attorney, and no possibility of appeal. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty of being a woman who dared to have a sexuality. The morning after the incident, Hong Kong woke up to a character assassination campaign of industrial scale. The headlines were not merely descriptive. They were moral judgments masquerading as news. Ming Pao and other tabloids moved beyond reporting actress found in restroom, using language designed to trigger disgust and righteous indignation. Phrases like toilet gathering were deployed with sneering irony, framing the act as a public defilement rather than a private indiscretion. The narrative was clear. She had dirtied a public space. She had disrespected the disabled community. She was cheap. The editorial teams at these newspapers engaged in a form of creative nonfiction. They took the raw, murky transcripts of the audio recording and editorialized them. They inserted descriptors like panting, moaning, and begging into the text accompanying the audio clips, effectively directing the audience on how to interpret the sounds. They turned a confused, intoxicated encounter into a scripted pornographic drama. They knew that sex sells, but dirty sex that can be judged, sells better. By framing the encounter as sordid and desperate, they allowed the readers to consume the salacious details while simultaneously feeling morally superior to the woman involved. It was a perfect feedback loop of voyeurism and condemnation. Then came the internet. If the newspapers provided the charges, the netizens of Hong Kong delivered the punishment. On forums like HK Golden and Facebook, the slut-shaming reached a fever pitch. The anonymity of the web allowed for a cruelty that would be unacceptable in face-to-face interaction. The comments section became a coliseum. Users dissected her appearance, her history, and her worth. The prevailing sentiment was that she was damaged goods. The misogyny was breathtakingly explicit. Users joked about her price, speculated on her sexual history, and created degrading memes that circulated virally on WhatsApp groups. This phenomenon revealed a terrifying aspect of the public complicity. It wasn't just the paparazzi who were the villains. It was the audience. The millions of people who clicked the link, who listened to the audio, who laughed at the jokes, they were all accomplices. They participated in the digital stoning. There was a perverse delight in seeing a star brought low. It was a manifestation of the tall poppy syndrome, the cultural urge to cut down those who have risen above the average, mixed with a deeply ingrained patriarchal desire to punish women who step outside the bounds of respectable behavior. Coffee Lamb attempted to defend herself, but every move she made was weaponized against her. When she initially tried to downplay the incident, claiming they were just talking, the media branded her a liar. When she later admitted to the intimacy under the weight of the evidence, they branded her shameless. It was a Kobayashi Maru scenario, an unwinnable test. If she stayed silent, she was guilty. If she spoke, she was deceptive. Crucially, the media expanded the blast radius of the scandal to include her family. Reporters camped outside her parents' home. They shoved cameras into the faces of her mother and father, demanding to know how they felt about their daughter's shame. This is a standard tactic of the Hong Kong tabloid press. Shame the clan to break the individual. By leveraging the traditional Chinese concept of face, they knew that attacking her family would inflict the deepest possible psychological wound on Lam. She wasn't just losing her career, she was being framed as an unfilial daughter who had brought disgrace upon her house. Throughout this storm, the silence of her peers was deafening. In Hollywood, a scandal of this nature might have elicited some support from feminist groups or fellow actors citing privacy rights. In Hong Kong in 2014, there was zero solidarity. Other TVB actresses, terrified of being associated with the taint, distanced themselves. To speak up for Coffee Lamb was to risk one's own purity rating. She was radioactive. The industry effectively quarantined her, leaving her to face the firing squad alone. The narrative constructed by the media was absolute. She was no longer Coffee Lamb, the actress. She was the toilet girl. This label was intended to be a permanent tattoo, a scarlet letter that would define her existence forever. The trial was over. The sentence was social death, and the executioners were already moving on to the next headline, leaving the wreckage of a human life in their wake. But the institution that had built her, TVB, had one final blow to deliver, a bureaucratic execution to formalize the social one. If the public reaction was a chaotic riot, the response from TVB was a cold, calculated bureaucratic execution. Television Broadcast Limited, the undisputed hegemon of Hong Kong media, operated not merely as a production studio, but as a moral arbiter for its audience. Its brand was built on family values, a sanitized version of reality designed to appeal to the widest possible demographic, from housewives to grandmothers. In this corporate calculus, an artist was only as valuable as their image rating. Coffee Lamb, with the stench of the toilet gathering scandal clinging to her, had become a liability. Her asset value had dropped to zero. Her risk value had skyrocketed. The termination process was swift and brutal, lacking any pretense of compassion or due process. Virginia Locke, the powerful executive in charge of talent management, effectively the godmother of TVB artists, summoned Lam. There was no discussion of rehabilitation, no offer of a suspension while the heat died down, and certainly no legal support to sue the paparazzi for privacy invasion. The meeting was a formality. The verdict had been decided in the boardroom long before Lam stepped through the door. The official reason for the termination was technically breach of contract. TVB contracts are notorious for their draconian morality clauses, broad stipulations that allow the network to fire any artist who brings disrepute to the station. But the subtext was clear. You embarrassed us. You broke the illusion. By engaging in a raw, messy human act that was caught on tape, Lamb had shattered the porcelain doll image the network required of its starlets. She was fired effectively immediately. Her existing scenes were either cut or downplayed. Her future projects were canceled. She was erased from the company roster as if she were a corrupted file. This corporate decapitation highlighted a glaring double standard that permeated Hong Kong society. While Coffee Lam was erased, the fate of the man in that toilet, Will Lam, was starkly different. Will Lam was a man. He was a businessman. He was wealthy. In the eyes of society and the corporate world, his participation in the scandal was viewed through a fundamentally different lens. For him, it was an embarrassment, yes, but it was often framed with a wink and a nudge, a boys will be boys narrative. There were no calls for his resignation from his company's board. His professional competence was not questioned because of his sexual conduct. He was not hounded to the point of sickness. He reportedly left Hong Kong for a short period, a retreat to Hangzhou to let the air clear, and then returned to his life, largely scathed only in his Google search results, not in his bank account or his social standing. Coffee Lam, conversely, faced the woman's penalty. Because her body was her product, her misuse of that body was seen as a professional failure. Because she was a woman, her sexuality was policed. The same act that made Will Lam a playboy made Coffee Lam a slut. TVB's decision to fire her reinforced this misogyny. It sent a message to every other woman in the industry. You are disposable. Your talent does not matter. Your hard work does not matter. Only your perceived purity matters. If you stain that, you are trash. The financial violence of the firing was immediate. Coffee Lam lost her base salary, meager as it was. But more importantly, she lost the platform that allowed her to earn outside income. Advertisers fled. Event organizers canceled bookings. She went from being a rising star with a full calendar to being unemployed and unemployable in the only industry she knew. The corporate guillotine had fallen, severing her from her livelihood and her identity. She was 24, publicly shamed, professionally exiled, and financially precarious. But the final cruelty of the system was yet to manifest. The stress of the trial by media and the shock of the corporate guillotine were not just psychological abstractions. They were biological triggers. While TVB was scrubbing her name from their credits, Coffee Lam's own immune system was beginning to misfire, preparing to launch an assault on her own body that would prove far more dangerous than any headline. The stage was set for the physical collapse. The phrase, died of a broken heart, is often dismissed as poetic hyperbole. But in the realm of medical science, the connection between extreme emotional trauma and physical collapse is a terrifying reality. For Coffee Lam, the public execution of her character did not end with the loss of her job. It migrated into her cells. The relentless bombardment of shame, the millions of mocking voices, the blinding flashbulbs, the rejection by her family at TVB triggered a catastrophic physiological response. Her body, overwhelmed by a sustained state of fight or flight, with nowhere to run, began to attack itself. In the months following the scandal, Lam began to notice terrifying changes. It started subtly, fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, a stiffness in her joints that felt like old age descending on a 24-year-old frame. Then came the skin. It began to thicken, to tighten, losing its elasticity. It felt, in her own words, like she was turning into stone. She was diagnosed with scleroderma, a rare, chronic autoimmune rheumatic disease. The horror of this diagnosis lies in its pathology. Scleroderma, derived from the Greek words scleros and derma, causes the immune system to produce too much collagen. This excess collagen deposits in the skin and internal organs, effectively creating scar tissue where there is no wound. It is a slow suffocation of the body's tissues. The physical manifestation was terrifyingly visible. Patients often develop what doctors call the mask facies. The skin around the mouth and eyes tightens so severely that the face loses the ability to express emotion. For an actress, this acts as a career death sentence. Coffee Lamb watched in the mirror as her defining feature, her expressive camera-ready face, began to freeze into a permanent, emotionless mask. Simple tasks like holding a fork or buttoning a shirt became agonizing battles against her own connective tissue. For a woman whose career depended on her appearance, this was a cruel irony. The stress of losing her beauty was now physically destroying it. But scleroderma is not just cosmetic, it is systemic. The hardening does not stop at the surface. It can affect the esophagus, making swallowing difficult. It can scar the lungs, making every breath a struggle. It can stiffen the heart and shut down the kidneys. Coffee Lamb was not just stressed, she was facing a legitimate mortality event. She was staring down the barrel of a future where she might be wheelchair-bound, fed through a tube, or dead within a decade. This was the wound that the tabloids never photographed. While the magazines were still running gleeful stories about her exile, Lamb was in and out of hospitals, battling a body that had become a prison. The depression that accompanied the disease was profound. She was isolated, sick, and convinced that her life was effectively over. The slut-shaming had metastasized into a physical rot. It is here, in the darkest trench of her life, that the narrative shifts from tragedy to survival. Traditional Western medicine offered management, steroids, immunosuppressants, but no cure. The side effects were brutal, causing weight gain and moon face, further damaging her self-image. Desperate, and perhaps realizing that her body was reacting to the poison of her mind, she turned to an alternative path. She didn't turn to drugs. She turned to movement. She began practicing yoga. Initially, it was not a spiritual pursuit. It was physical therapy. It was a desperate attempt to stretch the skin that was trying to crush her, to force oxygen into lungs that wanted to stiffen. It was agony. Every pose was a battle against her own hardened connective tissue. But in that pain, she found a locus of control. For the first time since the door of that toilet opened, she was in charge of her own body. The paparazzi couldn't see her on the mat. The TVB executives couldn't fire her from a downward dog. This was the turning point. The yoga mat became her sanctuary and her rehabilitation center. Day by day, breath by breath, she began to reverse the damage. The cortisol levels dropped. The inflammation subsided. The stone began to soften. She wasn't just fixing her skin, she was exorcising the trauma of 2014. She was sweating out the shame. This was not a miracle. It was a grueling, sweaty, painful reconstruction of a self that the world had tried to delete. And as her body healed, her ambition returned, not to go back to the world that broke her, but to build a new one entirely. The trajectory of a scandal in Hong Kong usually follows a predictable downward arc: exposure, shame, exile, and finally, oblivion. Coffee Lamb was scripted to follow this path into obscurity. She was supposed to become a trivia question, a cautionary tale whispered about in the makeup rooms of TVB. But Lamb refused to read the lines written for her by a misogynistic society. Instead, she executed one of the most remarkable pivots in the history of Asian entertainment, weaponizing the very thing that had been used to destroy her, her visibility. Her recovery began on the yoga mat, but her resurrection happened on the internet. Realizing that the traditional gatekeepers of media, the television executives, the film producers, the newspaper editors, would never forgive her for the sin of 2014, she decided to bypass them entirely. She recognized early on that the democratization of digital media offered a loophole in the blockade. If TVB wouldn't broadcast her, she would broadcast herself. She launched a YouTube channel. Initially, the traffic was driven by morbid curiosity, people searching for the toilet girl to see what had become of her. But what they found was not a broken woman begging for forgiveness, nor a scandal monger trying to cash in on notoriety. They found a teacher. They found a woman stripped of the heavy TVB makeup, sweating through grueling workouts, demonstrating a mastery of her body that commanded respect. The narrative shifted. The comments section, once a cesspool of insults, began to fill with gratitude. Women who felt betrayed by their own bodies, who struggled with weight or self-esteem, saw in Lam not a slut, but a survivor. Her content strategy marked a radical departure from her TVB days. On television, she was often dubbed in standard Mandarin or directed to speak in polished artificial tones. On YouTube, she spoke in raw, rapid-fire Cantonese, the language of the Hong Kong streets. She abandoned the heavy studio lighting and filters. She filmed herself sweating, grimacing in pain during a plank, and talking openly about her flaws. This vulnerability broke the fourth wall, dismantling the persona of the untouchable star and replacing it with the reality of a woman on the mat beside them, struggling through the same burn. She became an avatar of discipline. The economics of this pivot were staggering. As a B-list actress at TVB, Lam had scraped by on a meager salary, subject to the whims of casting directors. As a fitness influencer and the CEO of her own athleisure brand, Coffee Sweat, she built a commercial empire. Her subscriber count surged past 1 million, then 1.5 million, eclipsing the reach of many of the stars who had shunned her. Reports surfaced that her monthly income now dwarfed her annual earnings at TVB. This was the ultimate cold-blooded revenge success. She didn't need to sue the tabloids, she simply out-earned them. She proved that in the digital age, shame is a depreciating asset, but authenticity is a goldmine. Her personal life also defied the damaged goods label pinned on her by the conservative press. She married, not in shame, but in celebration, and became a mother. She reclaimed the domestic narrative, posting photos of her family that were curated, beautiful, and most importantly, consensual. Every image she shared was a subtle act of defiance against the paparazzi who had stolen her privacy in 2014. Now she controlled the lens. She decided what the world saw. However, the shadow of the IFC mall scandal extends beyond Lam's personal bank account. It left a permanent scar on the legal landscape of Hong Kong. For years, the 2014 incident stood as a glaring case study in a legal void. It highlighted a terrifying absurdity in the city's legal code. While it was illegal to peek into a window, the laws regarding recording in public spaces were dangerously outdated, written for a world of film cameras, not smartphones. Legal scholars and activists pointed to the Coffee Lamb case as Exhibit A in the fight for reform. It demonstrated that the existing laws, such as loitering or disorderly conduct in a public place, were insufficient to prosecute the specific act of non-consensual digital recording. The paparazzi who recorded her had technically operated within the law because they were in a public corridor. This loophole allowed for a culture of upskirting and voyeurism to flourish, with predators knowing the police were powerless to charge them with a serious crime. It took 7 long years for the system to catch up. In October 2021, the Legislative Council of Hong Kong finally passed the Crimes Bill 2021. This landmark legislation introduced specific offenses for voyeurism and the non-consensual recording of intimate parts. It finally criminalized the act of observing or recording someone for sexual gratification without their consent, regardless of whether the location was public or private. While the law was not named after her, the ghost of the toilet gathering hovered over the debate. The reform was a belated admission by the state that what happened to Coffee Lamb was not journalism, it was a crime. The story of Coffee Lamb is often retold as a celebrity scandal, a salacious footnote in the history of Hong Kong gossip. This is a mistake. It is, in reality, a modern horror story about the collision of technology, privacy, and misogyny. The audio recording from 2014 remains a ghost in the machine of the internet, a digital artifact that can never be fully deleted. But its power to hurt has been neutralized by the woman it was meant to destroy. Lam Tin Yu stood in the center of the panopticon, stripped bare by the gaze of millions, and refused to blink. She absorbed the toxicity of an entire culture, metabolized it through pain and sweat, and exhaled it as power. Yet, as we look back at the grain of those grainy photos and the hiss of that stolen audio, the final judgment should not be upon the couple behind the door. The judgment belongs to the crowd. In a world where every phone is a camera and every citizen is a potential spy, the question remains, are we merely consumers of information, or have we become accomplices in the destruction of privacy? The door to the toilet at the IFC Mall was just a piece of wood, but the ear pressed against it revealed a darkness in the culture itself. The scandal is over, but the recording is still playing, asking us who is truly listening.